In this tutorial, we're going to demonstrate a basic application that will convert temperature from Fahrenheit to Celsius. So here's a sample of what it's going to look like. We're going to have a label up here for some text field for input. The user will be able to click convert, and then we have a label where we'll be able to see the result. So if we put in 32 degrees and then click convert, then it should tell us what the Celsius temperature is. We'll also set this up so that when we go to edit this information, instead of getting the alphabetic keyboard, we'll set it up so that we can get a numeric keyboard to make data entry for the user much simpler. So to get started, I'm going to start Xcode, and we'll create a new Xcode project. Now you saw from the example that our project was only a single view, only one screen. So I'm going to choose the single view application and click next. And a product name, I'm just going to call it Temp Calc. And it's going to be targeted for the iPhone, and I'm going to make sure to use automatic reference counting. And we'll click next. And I'm going to save it to my desktop and click create. Okay, I'm going to start by opening up the view controller nib file. I'm going to set up the user interface. So let me bring this up to make it a little more room to make it easier. So I'm just going to put a label on here for the title. We have a text field that the user will enter in a temperature value. We have a button that they're going to click on when they're ready to do the conversion. And then we're going to have a result label down here that will put the result in here. So I'll start at the top. For my title, I'm just going to say Temp Calc Converter. And then I'm just going to center that. Now for my text field, I'm going to use some placeholder text. Rather than putting another label over here next to my text field, I'm just going to use placeholder text to show the user what the information is for. So I'm going to say this should be Fahrenheit temperature, and I'll stretch that out to make it a little wider so that they can see placeholder text. And that will go away. As soon as the user taps in there, then that placeholder text disappears. So I'll set up my button to say convert. And then for right now, I'm just going to leave the label there. I'm just going to make it wider so that it will stretch out to display our results from. So the interface is set up. And next I'm going to hide the utilities panel, and I'm going to go into the assistant editor, right? So I'm going to still be able to see my user interface here. And I have the viewcontroller.h file. Right, the viewcontroller nib file is our interface file. We have a viewcontroller header file and a viewcontroller implementation file. So the header file we're going to start with because we need to define the text field. We need to set up this button to do an action. And then we also need to define this label where the result information is going to go. So to do these definitions, first of all, I'm going to start with the text field since that's first. And I'm just going to make sure it's selected. And then I'm going to right-click and drag over into my header file or my interface file. And you can sort of see that this shows me some information here, insert outlet action or outlet collection. So when I'm over there and that appears, I'm going to release the mouse, and then I have this pop-up window where I can set up some features. So if we start with the connection, you can see on here that we have outlets and actions, and there's an outlet collection, but we'll refer to that in a later time. So for beginning app development, you could really think of things in terms of, are they an outlet or are they an action? Now an outlet is really a variable that an object can be referenced by. So for our text view, we're going to choose an outlet. And that's because we want to get the information from the text field to be able to reference that in our code to be able to do our conversion. And if something's not an outlet, then it could be an action. And an action is a method in our code that's called when an event takes place. And so we're going to be assigning our button here as an action. We're going to tell it when the button is clicked to perform an action. Now the name, this is going to be the name that the user interface is going to go by. So since this is where the user enters the temperature, I'm just going to call it temp input. And so we'll have a variable by that name that we'll be able to reference and get the value out of that text field. And storage is referring to our property directive, and strong really specifies that there is a strong or an owning relationship to the destination object. And most of the time when you're developing, your storage is going to be strong. So just kind of keep that in your mind that's going to be at about 90% or more of the time. So when I click connect, right, it adds this code into our header file. You can also see this little dot here, which is showing the connection of this particular property to this object in our user interface. Now, properties are defined in the header file, and then in the implementation file they're actually synthesized. So here we are defining it, and then synthesize actually access these properties within our class files. So we can see here that this property is set up as an IB outlet, interface builder outlet, and it is a UITextfield, and we gave it the name temp input. Now for the convert button, I'm going to do the similar thing. I'm going to select it in the interface builder, and I'm going to right click and drag over to the header file and then release. Now this time my connection, instead of being an outlet, I want this to be an action. I want this to trigger something to happen. And so now I need a name of that method, and so I'm just going to call it, the action is going to be convert temp, and the type is going to be ID, and touch up inside is typically what happens with a button, and we're going to send the argument of the sender. Seems a little weird to say that, but what will happen is when you tap that button, it will send its ID to this convert temp method. And then if we ever needed to reference the name of the button or anything about what was triggering that method, we can get it through the sender information. So I'm going to click connect, and you can also see here the connection with the dot. When I mouse over this, it's showing that this is what's connected to the convert temp. And the label, this we're going to set up so that our result information can get put into this label. So I'm going to right click into it again. Now this isn't going to be an action. Labels usually can only be an outlet. And I'm going to call this result label. And you can see that it's assigned the UI label type to it automatically, just by virtue of what it is and how we laid it out on the page. And again, the storage, we're just going to leave it as strong. So we'll click connect, and it's also added the property and the outlet name for it. So you can see here, these are nice visual representations that help you see how the information from your interface is connected to the properties and the methods that we're setting up in the header file. So remember, in the header file we have our properties defined as well as our methods, and this shows you what they're connected to. Now the temp calc converter label up here, we don't need to define any properties for this one because we're not doing anything with it. It's pretty much a static piece of text, a static label that's going to be there, and we're not changing the value of it or doing anything with it other than just displaying it on the screen. So we don't need to define any properties for this. All right, so we have the header file, and I'm also going to open up the implementation file. So we have the header file on the right, and then we have the implementation file on the left. And now let's see how these kind of carry information over from one to the other. So first of all, we have two properties, one for the temperature input and another one for the result label. So you can see that they have been synthesized. When we set these up in the header file, Xcode added the synthesize to the implementation file. So it's going to synthesize result label and temp input. And what synthesize does is it allows us to interact with the instance variables that we've defined in our interface over here. And this is really the concept of abstraction, where we have an instance variable, and rather than us being able to interact directly with a variable, we use its property instead to interact with it. And below that, in our implementation file, you can see some methods that were already set up for us just by nature of setting up or creating our project. We have a viewDidLoad method. So it's checking to see if the view loaded, and then we can add, and we'll be doing this in later examples, some code in here of what should happen when our view is loading or when it's been loaded. And then did unload a lot of times is reserved for removing things from memory. So should auto rotate to interface orientation. We'll be looking at working with this in a different demonstration where we can control what and how things look when the interface is rotated. But if you look down here, the last part is we have an IB action convert temp with the ID of sender. When we dragged from the button to our header file and we gave it an action name in the header file, then it also created this skeleton for our method or our action in the implementation file. So this is an IB action, so something in Interface Builder is going to trigger this convert temp action, and we set that up to be the convert button. And when the convert button is tapped, it's going to call this or start this convert temp method, and the button is also going to send its ID to this action in case we needed to access any information about what triggered this action. So we have our fundamental setup here in order to create the functionality. So to build in the functionality, I'm going to be working in the implementation file, so the viewControllerM file. So to make this a little easier to view, I'm going to exit out of the assistant editor, all right, and then we'll have a wider area here in order to display the code. I'm just going to move this up a bit. All right, so we have our convert temp action that's going to fire off when the user clicks the convert button. So what do we want to have happen? If we look at the interface file, right, the user is going to click convert. When that happens, we want to get the value of what's in this text field. We're going to do some simple math calculation to it to convert it to Celsius. And then we want to take the result of that and display it in this label. All right, so that's the process of what we have to go through in order to complete this app. I'm going to go back to the implementation file. So the button is set up that when it's tapped, it's going to do the convert temp action. So in here we need to do a couple of things. First of all, we have to create some variables, and one is for the Fahrenheit value. Now you can see that as I'm starting to type, we see some little error bubbles popping up over here. And this can be nice, and then sometimes it can be annoying because I haven't finished this yet, but it's telling me I have an error, and that's because I haven't finished it yet. So I'm going to just continue typing here. We're going to create a variable of the type double, and it's called farenheit, and I'm going to set that equal to, and this is going to be temp input. And you can see that as I start to type, once we have defined some of our variables, it recognizes them, and we can easily start to add them in without retyping. Right? If I just hit the tab key after that, it will input what was selected there. So we have temp input, which is the text field, and we want to get the value from what was in that text field, and we do that by using the dot notation. So I'm going to say temp input dot text, which is going to get the value of the text field, and we're going to take that value, and by default Objective-C thinks that it's text, but we need to convert it to double. So we just simply convert it by saying double value. And as I start to type, again, you can see the auto text pop up with different options, and it is double value, so I'm going to select that option. So that is going to create a variable of the type double called farenheit, and we use our text field temp input with our dot notation to get the value out of it. So temp input dot text will get the value, and then this is going to convert it into a double value instead of text field. If we don't do that, then we're going to get some error messages saying that, you know, they don't match, right? A double can't be text, it has to be a number value. So we have our farenheit, and we also need to create a variable for Celsius. So this is also going to be double, and this is going to be our formula to convert Fahrenheit to Celsius. So we are going to use our Fahrenheit value, and we're going to subtract 32 and divide that by 1.8. Now as you see here, as we're typing, we're getting, now this is a warning. So if you want to see what these are as you type, right, we can click on them or double click on it. It says unused variable. So we've created the variable, we haven't used it anywhere. So it's just warning us that we haven't used it yet. Okay, now we have our formula to do the conversion, and we want to take that value and place it back into the result text string. So what we have to do is to compose a string, and then we'll put that string into the text string. So first we need a type. Just like we have double for Fahrenheit and double for Celsius, the string type in Xcode or in Objective-C is NSString. And you'll see NSString a lot. NS is short for next step, which was the company that Steve Jobs created when he was ousted from Apple. And they created this next step programming language, which has been a legacy in the Mac OS X Objective-C language. So rather than just a plain string that you might have used in other languages, NSString is next step version of a string. So we're going to say this is a type of NSString, and we're going to give it a variable name, and I'm going to call this result string. And you might say, well, what's this asterisk for? And why don't we have an asterisk in front of Fahrenheit and Celsius? Okay, the Fahrenheit and Celsius are double, which are primitive data types. So they hold basic types of information. So we're okay with saying double, or if we had an integer, we would use int, or if it was a floating point number, we would have float. So we don't have to use the asterisk like we have here in defining a variable. So primitive data types we're really just assigning values to. Now when we have an NSString, right, and we have an asterisk here, this is for object data types and pointers. So you'll be working with a lot of objects in Objective-C, and text strings are object types. So we can't just store a string as a primitive data type. So objects have associated instance variables and methods, which make them a little bit more complex. So a string is going to be more complex than a double value or an integer or a floating point number. So it has to be handled differently in memory. So to declare a variable as an object, we're really using a pointer reference to the object. And so when we use a pointer, we use an asterisk. Now we only need to use this when we are defining it or when we are initializing it. Each time we go to reference a result string, we don't have to use the asterisk after it's been declared. So once it's been declared, you don't need to use the asterisk each time you're going to reference it. So when a variable is a pointer to an object, like we have here, it's said to reference or point to the object. And when we have a primitive data type, like we have here, this actually stores the data. It doesn't point to a reference to it, it actually stores the data. So keep this in mind as you start to go through, and you'll be seeing this a lot as you start to develop in Objective-C. Okay, so now continuing on with our string. Our string, we're going to set that equal to, and it's a string object, an NSString. And before an object can be used, memory has to be allocated and the contents of this object has to be initialized. So we have to allocate and initialize our string. So we're going to say NSString, and we're going to say alloc, which is short for allocate. And instead of just plain initializing it, we're going to initialize it with a format. So it's init with format. And again, as we start to type, we get some options in here, and we're just going to choose init with format with an NSString. So the one then in here that is already selected. Right, and now it's waiting for me to fill in the information here for how we want to format this string. And I'm going to type this in and then I'm going to explain it. Okay, so I have init with format. Then we have an @ symbol, and this is used for printing a text string. So our text string is inside the double quotes, and you can see within here we have a placeholder. And these placeholders will be replaced with the variables that follow our string. So you can see after our string we have a comma and then Fahrenheit and Celsius. So Fahrenheit is going to be equal to whatever comes from the input text field. Celsius is going to come from our formula result. And so then they get placed into our text string at these placeholders. So the .2f is for 2 decimal places, floating. If we just had the %, it would put Fahrenheit in and Celsius in without having decimal places or floating decimal places in there. So we've created the string, and now we're also getting that message again, probably because it hasn't been used, right? So now we need to put that into the result text. And we do that by saying result label dot text is going to be equal to result string. So we'll take this result string and put it into the result label text. So I'm going to save everything. Let's run it in the simulator. See what happens. Build succeeded is good. Okay, so we can put in, we know that 32 should convert to 0 degrees Celsius. So we can check our math. Okay, now one of the things, instead of having letters show up, since we know these are numbers, we can set it up so that we can just have a number input. So to do that, I'm going to stop the simulator and go into our interface file, and I'm going to bring back up the inspector panel, and I'm going to select the Fahrenheit temp text field, and in the attributes panel, change the type of keyboard over here from default to, now you can look and compare these two different ones. We can have number pad, and let's run that and see what the number pad looks like. Right, so when you type in here, we get just numbers, no decimals. So let's try, instead of number pad, numbers and punctuation, and run it. So then, now we have numbers and we can get the decimal places in there. So then, that makes it easier for the user so they don't have this and have to do an extra step in order to type in numbers. Okay, the one other thing we can do is, rather than having that text show, rather than having it say label, let's just delete that label text out of there. And once you click off of it, it looks like it's gone, but it's really there. You can mouse over and click on it. If you have trouble finding it, you can always come over here to the view and click on different things, and you can see them being selected, so you'll be able to find it again. So now when we run it, it won't show up initially until there's something converted, and then we'll have the result in there. So that's just a basic little calculator in order to learn how to add some actions and outlets, being able to control information that's being displayed back on your screen, and setting up a basic user interface.